So we're starting with special parallelogram. Last week we learned that a parallelogram is a four-sided figure and it has five attributes, which are opposite side being parallel, opposite side being congruent, and then opposite angle being congruent, and the diagonal bisect each other, and also the angle next to each other from 180 degrees, so they are supplementary. Okay, we said consecutive angles are supplementary. So today we're gonna first of all study a special parallelogram called rectangle. So we said that a rectangle is a quadrilateral with congruent angles. In a rectangle, we know each of these, if each of the angles is 90 degrees, so the angles are congruent. So since the angles are congruent, we can say that a rectangle is also a parallelogram. And then how do we cut it? This is how it goes. This is a rectangle here. So it means each of these angles, let me change color, maybe put it red. Each of these angles here will be 90. And the opposite sides are parallel. So this arrow shows that these two sides are parallel. And I'm gonna put two double arrows here to show that the left and the right hand side two are parallel. And aside that, opposite side two are congruent. So this side equals to this, lower equals to upper, and then left equals to right. So I'm gonna put double bars here. And in terms of the diagonals, I'm gonna cut this place towards this side and also this place towards this side. As you can see, the diagonals here are also congruent. They bisect each other. So if this side is 7, this side has to be 7, this side has to be 7, this side has to be 7. So the diagonal here are also congruent, okay? So what else is true here? All the rules for the parallelogram occurs in a rectangle. The opposite sides, we're gonna say, are parallel. According to my drawing, the opposite sides are parallel. And as well, aside being parallel, they are also congruent. How do I, okay, congruent. Opposite sides are parallel as well as congruent. And what else? And what else? Opposite angles are also congruent. And then the consecutive angles are supplementary because, if you take this upper angle at the left-hand side and then the one at the lower-hand side, so when you do 90 plus 90, it makes up to 180. Okay, so consecutive angles are supplementary. And the diagonals also bisect each other. As you can see, if this, half of these pairs of diagonals are 7, 7. So if you put the whole diagonal together, it's gonna be 14, 14, okay? So the diagonals bisect each other. And the diagonals are what? They're also congruent. So you see how beautiful a rectangle is? It has opposite sides that are parallel and congruent. Opposite angles are congruent, 90, 90. And then opposite consecutive angles are supplementary because when you do 90 plus 90, it gives you 180, okay? And the diagonals are also congruent, okay? And another special parallelogram gonna be the rhombus. So in a rhombus, a rhombus is a quadrilateral with also congruent sides. You see the difference here now. So if they ask you the difference between a rhombus and a rectangle has congruent angles, 90, 90, 90. but a rhombus only has congruent sides. The angles are not congruent, only the sides are. In a rectangle, the sides are not equal, okay? In a rhombus, the sides are equal. In a rectangle, the angles are equal, but in a rhombus, the angles are not equal. So that's the major specifications here, okay? Definition of rectangle, congruent angles. Definition of rhombus, congruent sides. So we're gonna see, all those specific things. And a rhombus is also a parallelogram, like the rectangle, because they have four sides and opposite sides are parallel. So I'm gonna show them here. Oh. Since we said a rhombus is a quadrilateral with congruent sides, so it means this side gonna be equals to this side. This side is also gonna be equals to this side. And the second definition says a rhombus is a parallelogram, which means opposite side gonna be parallel. So I'm gonna say this side is parallel to this. The left-hand side gonna also be parallel to the right-hand side. I'm also gonna draw the diagonals. Let me draw in black, in red, this and this. So if you check very well, you're gonna see that these two diagonals, they cut at an angle that is 90 degrees. So they're gonna be perpendicular. So which means this side gonna be equals to this side. So if this side is 6, this side is gonna be 6. And then this side here gonna be equals to this side. So if this side is 8, this side has to be 8. So here, the diagonals are not congruent, okay? They are just perpendicular. So let's go back and put the specifications. Opposite sides are parallel like in a rectangle. Oh, double L before single L. And then opposite sides are congruent, like in the case of a rectangle. Opposite angles are also congruent in the case of a rectangle. In the case of rectangle, all angles, opposite angles are congruent and all angles are also congruent. But in the case of the rhombus, only opposite angles that are congruent. Okay, but not all angles are congruent. So you need to take note of that. So it means this angle gonna be the same as this. So that's why I have one angular, say, sign. But here I'm gonna put double to show that they are different. Or let me change color to show that they are, they are different. These opposites are quite different from the opposite in purple. Okay, the ones in black are different from the ones in purple. Okay. And then we're gonna go further. Consecutive angles are always supplementary because we're dealing with a parallelogram. And the diagonal also bisect each other, as you can see here, 6, 6, 8, 8. But here the difference is that the diagonals in a rhombus are perpendicular. Why the diagonals in a rectangle are congruent, okay? So those are those two specifications you have to know. And then if we go further, we're gonna see a square. As we all know, a square is a quadrilateral with congruent sides and congruent angles. So here, what we can see is that all the specifications of rectangle and rhombus, are encompassed, are clustered, are put together to form a square. Because in its first definition of rectangle, we say quadrilateral with congruent angles. So in the case of the square, we're gonna say with congruent angles and congruent sides. So it means whatever that is in a square, in a rectangle is in a square, and whatever that is in a rhombus is also in a square. And as we all know, a square is a four-sided figure, so, and opposite side being parallel, so a square is a parallelogram as well. because the first definition of parallelogram is that opposite sides are parallel, okay? As the name implies, parallelogram. The graph. So here a square is a parallelogram since it obeys all the specifications of rectangle. So a square is also a rectangle. And it also obeys all the specifications of a rhombus. So a square is also a rhombus. I'm gonna put this thing here. So, oh my God. Okay, let me write it down here. And then take it up. How? Because we say in a parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel. So this side gonna be parallel to this. And also this side gonna be parallel to this. And in a rectangle, we say opposites, all angles are congruent. So, and we know in a square, all the angles are congruent too, because each of these angles are 90 degrees. And we also said in a rhombus, the diagonals are what? Are perpendicular. Oh, this is ugly. So I'm gonna draw the diagonals here. So that where we know the difference between rhombus and rectangle is that in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent, okay? So here we're gonna see in the square that diagonals are congruent. So if this guy is 7, these guys have to be 7, 7, 7. And in a rhombus, the diagonals are perpendicular. So as you can see here in a square, the diagonals are also perpendicular, okay? So a square is a combination of rectangle and rhombus, okay? So after finishing that, you're gonna see here parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel. So here, since opposite sides are parallel, you can see that in a rhombus, where opposite sides are parallel, but each of the sides are congruent. While in a rectangle, opposite sides are parallel, but each of the angles are congruent. But all the two specific, specialities are encompassed, in the square. Square has both diagonals that are congruent and diagonals that are also perpendicular. And if you see this tree, quadrilateral is a four-sided figure. And then under quadrilateral, we have parallelogram, four-sided figure with opposite side being parallel. We have trapezoid. Trapezoid is just a four-side figure, but only one pair of side that's parallel, okay? And then the kite, four-sided figure with a consecutive side being equal. Sorry, and then under parallelogram, we have rectangle and rhombus, because on the rectangle is a four-sided figure with opposite side being parallel. But the difference here is in terms of the diagonals of the rectangle are congruent, whereas the diagonals of rhombus are what? Perpendicular. And the two of them are gonna form the square, the master of all, because under a square, we have diagonals that are both congruent and perpendicular, okay? So if you follow this tree very well, these are everything that are good about rectangles. These are specifications of parallelogram you need to know. Opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, diagonals bisect. For rectangle, all angles are congruent and diagonals are congruent. Those are the two things you need to know about rectangle. All angles 90, 90, 90 congruent, and then diagonals are also congruent. For rhombus, all sides are congruent and diagonals are perpendicular. These are things you need to know. And then lastly, both of these guys will form a square, because in a square, both the diagonals are both congruent and perpendicular. Okay, so here we're gonna name these 6 figures, I think, according to the most specific. Okay, they're gonna have something in common, but you know, we're gonna make sure to get specific names for each of them, even though they have something in common. Since all of them are 4-sided figures, so we can say they are parallelogram. This one is also a parallelogram. This is a parallelogram. This is a parallelogram. This is a parallelogram. I jumped the fourth one because I'm coming back. And then in this, the first one, what can you say about the sides? Savannah, what can you say about the side of this first figure? Okay, since all the sides are congruent, what kind of figure is that? You said? No. When we have, according to these 2 names we just introduced ourselves, rectangle and rhombus. Okay. If you see this figure now, you know, in a rectangle, all the angles are congruent, but here, since none of these angles shows 90 degrees, and then only the sides that are congruent. So what kind of figure is this? Rhombus. Okay. So I'm going to write rhombus as RH. Okay. So this is more specific. It's a parallelogram, but it's a rhombus because we can see, as we can see, all sides are congruent. It cannot be a square because we didn't see any of these angles that's 90 degrees. Okay. So the second figure, what do you think should be the second figure here? The second drawing? Does it look like a rhombus?
No. It's a square.
It's a square. Okay. You said it's a square. Someone else? Does it look like a rectangle? What did we say about rectangle, about the angles? Is a square a rectangle? Let's go with the definition of a rectangle. We say in a rectangle, all angles are congruent, 90-90, okay? So here, are all angles not congruent? Yes, they are. So since all angles is, each of these angles is 90 degrees here, so this is a rectangle. What about the sides? Are the sides not congruent here? Yes, they are. All these sides are congruent, so this is also a rhombus. And in a square, we know that sides are congruent and angles are congruent. So this is also a square. So the most specific, this figure has 4 names. It's a parallelogram, it's a rectangle, it's a rhombus, and it's also a square. But the least or the most specific one we can give to this is just a square. Even though it can be a rhombus, because in a rhombus, we know all sides are congruent. And here we can see this side equals to this, equals to this, equals to this. All angles are congruent to show that it's rectangle. So here, 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 same. Whereas the definition of a square says all angles congruent, all sides congruent, okay? So the most specific name here is a square, even though it has 3 other big names, okay? The next figure with the definition of rectangle, is this figure a rectangle? Does it show that it's a rectangle? In a rectangle, we said all angles are congruent. Are the angles here congruent? No, so this cannot be a rectangle. In terms of rhombus, we said all sides are congruent. Does it show that all sides are congruent here? No. And then in a square, we said all sides are congruent and angles are congruent. No sides is congruent here, and no sides are, not all the angles that are congruent, not all the sides that are congruent, because there's no sign that all sides are congruent here. So this cannot be a square. So this is just a parallelogram, okay? It doesn't have specific name. The one below, we first of all said it's a parallelogram because all sides are parallel, opposite sides are parallel. What about the angles? Are all the angles congruent? Yovara? See the angles. Are they congruent? See, this is 90, 90, 90, 90. So are they congruent? Okay, so here, since all the angles are congruent, we can say it's a rectangle. Let's go with rhombus. In a rhombus, we said all the sides are congruent, but here we can only see that only opposite sides that are congruent. Upper is the same as lower, left is the same as right. So here, is this figure a rhombus? Christian, no. Okay, so rhombus is out of it. Since it's a rectangle, but it cannot be a rhombus, then it cannot be a square. Okay, so the definition of a square goes off too. So here, the most specific name for this image here is just a rectangle, okay? Then the one here, for it to be a parallelogram, we have to see that sides are, opposite sides are parallel. So there's no sign to show that opposite sides are parallel here. So this cannot even be a parallelogram. So this is just a quadrilateral, meaning a four-sided figure. First of all, for you to be able to say it's a rectangle or rhombus or square, it has to be a parallelogram, okay? Meaning opposite sides being parallel. But here we cannot even see that. There's no sign to show opposite sides are parallel. Since opposite sides are not parallel here, so it cannot even be a parallelogram. So it's just a simple four-sided figure. So, and a simple four-sided figure is called what? A quadrilateral. Quadri from French quatre, and then lateral from French sides. And the last figure here, can it be a rectangle? Sayara?
Yeah.
Why?
Because the opposite sides are equal.
Yes, and aside that, what about the angles?
The angles are all 90 degrees.
Okay, so the most specific things you have to say is that, as you can see here, a rectangle is a quadrilateral with congruent angles, okay? So since all angles here are congruent, so this could be this is a rectangle. Sarah, Tyler Yoda, can it be a rhombus?
No.
Okay, why? Because the definition of a rhombus says what? All sides are congruent. Since all sides are not congruent here, so this cannot be a rhombus. So a figure that can only be a rectangle and cannot be a rhombus cannot be a square. Okay, for you to have a rectangle, for you to have a square, that figure must be a rhombus and a rectangle, okay? Like in the case of this second one here, okay? But once it's only either, when it's only either of the two, that figure can never be a rectangle, okay? It can never be a square. If that figure is only a rhombus, it cannot be a square. If it's only a rectangle, it cannot be a square. But if it is both rectangle and rhombus, so it means that figure can be a square. Definitely, without even stress. So that's what we needed to take home today. Two things to know: rectangle, all angles are congruent and the diagonals are congruent. Rhombus, all sides are congruent and the diagonals are perpendicular. And a figure that is both rectangle and rhombus is definitely a square, because in a square, all sides and all angles are congruent, okay? And the diagonals are congruent and perpendicular. So that was what we needed to teach ourselves today. Then we just gonna go to the homework and see what we can do for today. And please let us get ready for Wednesday when we're gonna see all this in our quiz. I appreciate you all.